Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the July 2nd distribution team demo for the week. This week, I'll be demoing some work I've been working on for a little while, mostly during the last release, around a proof of concept that I have up for review to the backend GitLab Rails developers around encrypted LDAP passwords. So this change is specifically for ensuring that there isn't plain text passwords stored on the file system. And there's a few or at least one extra condition we had for the very first iteration, and that was just that we had ruled out Vault or something like Vault for the very first iteration, as we had already had some customer feedback from some of our users and customers who are waiting for this, that wasn't going to be acceptable to them. The plan is still, once this is rolled out, that we would eventually add support for things like Vault and other KMS systems, but that the first thing that we rolled out was something a little bit more homegrown and less, well, as a result, would be less feature rich. So I'm just going to go ahead and show off the current state of the merge request. So this is a POC, and so the current way to take a look at it is using the GitLab GDK, and it's over in the main GitLab EE Rails code base. So I'm just going to fire up some of these services needed to run the Rails or run the GitLab backend. I'm not going to start up the whole application to show this off, just what's necessary. So I've got nothing running at the moment. I'm going to start Italy, Redis, and Postgres. And that basically gets me the backend services needed for me to then run Rails console and stuff like that, and load the config and show it off in that manner. So the first thing I'm going to show is I'm in my IDE here. I'm in the GitLab project in the source code, and I have my GitLab YML up outside of Omnibus. This is the when you're in the source code, this is basically the config file for GitLab. And I am currently in development mode, so I'm in the development section or the development environment, and I'm in the LDAP configuration section. So a few notes about LDAP configuration in GitLab. The configuration in terms of well-defined configuration, we have this OmniAuth section in the config, and under it, well, actually, it's actually a peer to the OmniAuth section. How it ties into OmniAuth happens in the code base, but we have an LDAP section that provides you an area where you can provide a hash of servers, and this hash can contain, in the case of EE, can contain multiple servers, and you're in charge of basically the key name that you provide them. You have to have one that is at least named main, as I have here, and in the community edition of the code base, or just if you don't have an EE license, you only have access to adding one LDAP server. But if you have EE license, you have the ability to add a second one, and you can name them whatever you want, and that will come into play or be an important part of the implementation of how we pass these encrypted passwords. But at the moment, I have a password stored in plain text in this file, and rather than set up an LDAP, have an LDAP server set up to hit this, I'm just going to show you what this looks like. This config looks like from within the GitLab code base. So I'm going to bring back in my terminal and run a Rails console. And so all of the authentication that happens in GitLab is done through a Rails tie-in called Devise, and under Devise has support for logins of various types under its OmniAuth section. So this is where it kind of ties in to LDAP, is that even though in our config we have OmniAuth, which provides things like OAuth 2 login and stuff like that, in our config we have it separate from LDAP. In the code base, they eventually, in the Devise setup, they eventually all combine in under OmniAuth. So our LDAP config gets added as a provider under OmniAuth. So within the code base, they become the same thing under OmniAuth. In the config, LDAP is treated separately. But with my Rails environment loaded, I can just print out all my OmniAuth configs. This is just my local dev instance. And we can see the first one is LDAP. And a bunch of config on it. And then there's another one in the dev instances for testing that is the Google OAuth 2. And all the settings are pretty much empty. It's just a dummy one. But in the LDAP one, we can see, we should be able to see that there is a password set. Actually, I'm not seeing if there's a password set. Oh, no, that should be fine. Interesting. I didn't previously take a look at the password set scenario. I'm not sure if I'm setting the password regularly right. Instead, I'll take a look at that a little later. Instead, I'm going to slightly change the config to show you what I was intending to show in the end, which is the encrypted password, which doesn't involve setting a password here. The idea is that you wouldn't have a password at all for LDAP in your config file, and you would instead run a command to create the password. So a new command has been created under rake. For editing the LDAP secret. And it's in the case of LDAP, it's a YAML file that does give you, the command does give you like that commented out example in it, but essentially it's a list of your LDAP server key that there has to be main, but there can also be ones you customize if you had an E license, and then your password. And that command opens in whatever, either you can set the editor environment variable, or it just runs the editor command if you haven't set it. And that saves a file in the config folder called LDAP secret yaml.enc, and the file location for that can be changed in the GitLab config. And if I cat out that, it's encrypted, and I'll go into the encryption method in a minute here. And I'm just going to fire up the Rails console again, and we should be able to see, at least in the case of the encrypted password, we should now see it unencrypted in memory from within the console, even though it's only encrypted on disk. Just waiting for the Rails environment to finish loading. And if we load the OmniAuth configs again, we can see we have our password in there. The thing we had done initially that I hadn't tried before was setting the password in the configs file. So I'm not sure. I'll take a closer look after this fall to make sure that I haven't broken that apparently with this merge request, because I hadn't tested that previously, or if I'm just setting it at the wrong level in the config by default. But yeah, that's kind of how the end result looks at the moment. To show you what some of the code changes in place are, I'll exit out and just quickly jump into the IDE. So in the LDAP config itself, there is, well, actually, we can start in the command. So there's a new command added. I chose to add it in Rake. It could have been also added as an actual Rails command. And it makes use of some existing helpers that Rails provides regarding around launching an editor. And it pulls in the LDAP config encrypted secret, which is a method that I've added as part of this MR. And then there's, if the file doesn't already exist, it writes the template to the file. So this write command writes it encrypted to the file, and then it then opens it using the editor within a change block. So this is all actually kind of a duplication of something that already exists in Rails. So Rails, a couple versions ago, introduced this idea of encrypted config, and they added a command called, well, encrypted configuration to the Rails code base that you can run from the command line. It does the same thing, and that's how we have these editors available. The reason we didn't just use that command outright or just alias the command is the template it uses is very specific to AWS passwords. It's expecting that you're providing AWS secrets as kind of the example, and that example didn't really fit well for the LDAP one. So this is kind of a recreation of that function. And in general, this POC is just extending that encrypted config that Rails currently has in place as an example. They don't have it in place as an example, but that they have in place as kind of a recommended setup for new installs. So this was the command. So next we'll take a look at the encrypted secrets function quick. So that's in the LDAP config. And so this calls into a new method that's been kind of added in the higher level GitLab settings class that has this encrypted command in which you pass, currently you pass the file that you want encrypted, and it returns you the encryption config object, which is something that you can index into, and it'll automatically grab, like it'll decrypt and read the YAML, and then let you index into YAML. In the case of YAML, or you can just use read if you're just storing not YAML but storing just other text in it. But this is intended to be so at this level, we're doing something LDAP specific, and we're specifically passing this LDAP config. But the configuration added here is intended that we could use this for other passwords in GitLab as well to provide the same functionality. And just to compare it to how the Rails codebase have implemented their own version of this, theirs is listed under application encrypted and works similarly. Because ours is slightly diverged, and I'll get into that, is why I didn't just like overwrite the existing one. So we have one that's a little more GitLab specific, and I'll jump into that right now. So in the settings RB we have in GitLab, this is an encrypted function that I was just talking about, and it just returns this new GitLab encrypted configuration. And this encrypted configuration is just an extension of Rails's active support encrypted configuration. So the reason why ours is different, and this is really the only reason, is that the Rails encrypted configuration it's something fairly new a couple of releases ago, and they have this new syntax for a master key. So the master key is a new file that they'll even generate for you on the file system that's used for encryption. And in the regular Rails code base, this is kind of one of the first, not in the regular Rails code base, but I mean in the greater core Rails code base, this is kind of the first time that sort of encryption type key has been introduced. And in our case, we've already had a secrets.yaml that includes encryption keys that we use for encrypting the database and other stuff for a while now. So rather than introduce a new file, we wanted to like make use of our existing stuff. And a lot of the Rails codebase has hard-coded this master key idea into this new encrypted file stuff. So that's why we have a fork here. So in this case, we're setting it to it, because this is a POC, we're setting it to an existing key we have, which is our DB keybase. As this POC moves forward, we might give it its own key, but we wouldn't, at this point, we wouldn't want to introduce a new file essentially on the file system for users to have to back up and manage separate from the secrets.yaml. So that's why our implementation in the POC is like slightly forked. There's also, so this calls into encrypted configuration, which is an existing Rails method of encrypting the configuration. It's using the underlying encrypting file from Rails. There's also discussion in the POC revolving around whether we should use this or whether we should use the gem lockbox. So lockbox is a gem that we added that provides encryption just in general. It has some plugins that you can use it for encrypting attributes in the database and stuff like that. But it gives you a lot of fine-grained control over the encryption methods versus this one provided by Rails, which is kind of whatever they built in by default. So we use Lockbox in GitLab already for encrypting the Terraform state file for the new Terraform storage feature in GitLab. So Lockbox is already in use for that, for encrypting and decrypting it as it gets stored into object storage and back. And so it could potentially also be used, swapped, this current implementation that we have here could be swapped out for Lockbox, but we could keep things like the editor and the encrypted settings option. Finally, I guess I will show. So previously I had created the secret, but I can edit the secret after it's been created and make changes. And there's also a show command, which will just print out the plain text to the terminal. And that's it. Did anyone have any questions? Sounds like no. Thanks everyone for attending the demo.